Ibrahim Traoré's leadership in Burkina Faso has come to embody one of the most unexpected yet impactful shifts in Africa's modern political and economic landscape. Within a short period of time, he has launched a series of projects that not only redefined Burkina Faso's internal trajectory, but also sent tremors across Western capitals, exposing the growing reality that Africa is no longer willing to remain in a subordinate position. Each of these projects carries political, economic, cultural, or military weight, and when placed together, they paint a clear picture of a country striving for sovereignty while simultaneously shaking the foundations of a global order that has long been defined by Western dominance. To truly appreciate the magnitude of these 10 projects, one must view them not in isolation, but as a coordinated roadmap toward a future where Africa asserts control over its destiny. The first project that unsettled the West was the push to reclaim control over Burkina Faso's mineral wealth, particularly gold. For decades, the country's gold reserves, which rank among the richest in Africa, were largely exploited by Western corporations that extracted massive profits while leaving behind poverty, environmental destruction, and little long-term investment in the local economy. Traoré challenged this order by pushing forward reforms aimed at nationalizing or renegotiating mining contracts. This was not simply about resource sovereignty, it was about sending a powerful signal that the age of cheap access to Africa's resources under unfair terms was ending. The announcement of stricter mining laws, higher royalties for foreign companies, and the creation of mechanisms to channel resource revenues into public infrastructure projects rattled Western investors and governments. Suddenly, Burkina Faso was no longer a passive player in the global gold market, but a country determined to rewrite the rules. Closely tied to this was the second project, the establishment of joint ventures and partnerships with non-Western powers. Instead of relying on Western financing or corporations, Traoré sought deals with countries such as Russia, China, and Turkey, which were more willing to provide infrastructure and security assistance in exchange for resource access under more balanced terms. By opening the door to these partnerships, Burkina Faso not only diversified its economic and diplomatic relations, but also weakened Western monopolies. This was particularly evident in the energy and infrastructure sectors, where Chinese and Turkish companies began constructing roads, power plants, and industrial facilities. The West viewed this shift with alarm because it symbolized the erosion of their influence in regions once considered secure spheres of control. The third project revolved around food security and agriculture. Traoré understood that true independence could not be achieved if Burkina Faso remained dependent on imported food supplies. He spearheaded a campaign to modernize agriculture, expand irrigation systems, and invest in grain storage facilities. This agricultural push was designed not only to feed the nation, but also to turn Burkina Faso into a potential food exporter within West Africa. By promoting large-scale cultivation of rice, maize, and millet, while also encouraging modern farming techniques, he aimed to reduce vulnerability to global price fluctuations and external pressures. Western powers, which often leveraged food aid as a tool of influence, recognized that such a project would diminish their ability to apply economic pressure in times of political disagreement. The symbolism of feeding oneself became as powerful as the act itself, signaling a deeper form of independence. Fourth came the bold project of military reform. Traoré prioritized strengthening the armed forces, not just in terms of numbers, but in strategy, training, and equipment. This included collaborations with Russia for military hardware, as well as programs to recruit and train young Burkinabe in counterterrorism and national defense. For years, the West had maintained that only their presence and expertise could secure countries like Burkina Faso from insurgencies. By rejecting this narrative and investing in indigenous military capacity, Traoré undermined a central pillar of Western influence, dependency on foreign troops. The creation of new military bases, the introduction of locally developed security doctrines, and the celebration of soldiers as protectors of sovereignty reshaped national identity and rattled Western interests, which thrived on fragile, dependent states. The fifth project dealt with regional alliances. Traoré was instrumental in promoting closer military and political cooperation with neighboring countries facing similar threats and struggles, particularly Mali and Niger. Together, these countries formed what could be called a new anti-colonial bloc, openly challenging the dominance of Western-backed institutions in West Africa. The creation of shared security pacts, coordinated military campaigns, and joint infrastructure projects among these nations directly threatened Western strategies of divide and rule. By encouraging solidarity, Traoré undermined attempts to isolate Burkina Faso and amplified its voice in regional and global arenas. This project demonstrated that the collective strength of African nations could serve as a counterweight to Western influence. The sixth project was Cultural Renaissance. Traoré invested heavily in promoting Burkinabe culture, history, and education, aiming to rebuild a sense of pride and identity. Schools were encouraged to incorporate African history into their curricula. Universities expanded programs that emphasized self-reliance and indigenous knowledge, and public festivals celebrating local traditions were given state support. For the West, whose soft power often relied on cultural dominance through media, education, and narratives that diminished African histories, this renaissance was unsettling. By teaching future generations to value their own heritage and to question external narratives, Burkina Faso planted seeds of intellectual independence that no foreign power could easily uproot. Seventh was the project of technological independence. Recognizing that modern power is deeply linked to digital infrastructure and control over information, Traoré initiated policies to develop local IT capacity. Investments were made in expanding Internet access, supporting local tech startups, and building cybersecurity capabilities to protect the country from external manipulation. Partnerships with non-Western tech companies offered alternatives to Western-dominated platforms, while programs to train young Burkinabe in coding, engineering, and digital entrepreneurship laid the groundwork for long-term transformation. Western capitals, which relied heavily on control of digital ecosystems to monitor and shape political discourse in Africa, found themselves increasingly shut out from Burkina Faso's digital future. The eighth project was energy independence. Traoré championed renewable energy investments, particularly solar power, to reduce reliance on costly imported fuels and Western-backed energy companies. With abundant sunlight, Burkina Faso had the potential to transform itself into a leader in solar energy on the continent. Projects involving local cooperatives, as well as partnerships with non-Western firms, began to materialize, promising affordable electricity for rural and urban areas alike. Energy independence represented more than economics. It represented the dismantling of a system in which Western corporations and financial institutions dictated access to power. The symbolism of lighting homes and powering industries through self-directed initiatives resonated deeply, undermining narratives that portrayed African states as eternally dependent on external aid. The ninth project was the diplomatic offensive. On the global stage, Traoré emerged as a vocal critic of Western double standards in international institutions such as the United Nations and the African Union. He openly denounced neocolonialism, demanded reforms to global financial systems, and consistently advocated for Africa's right to self-determination. His speeches resonated not only within Africa, but also among movements in the Global South, from Latin America to Asia. The West, accustomed to African leaders taking submissive or conciliatory positions, was forced to confront a new reality. A young leader from a small landlocked nation had captured global attention, with uncompromising demands for justice. The diplomatic project was as much about reshaping perceptions as it was about policies, and its ripple effects unsettled, entrenched global hierarchies. Finally, the 10th project that truly shook the West was the economic diversification strategy. Traoré sought to move Burkina Faso away from being a mono-resource economy dependent on gold. Initiatives were launched to promote manufacturing, local processing of raw materials, and investments in small and medium-sized enterprises. Efforts to build textile industries, encourage local production of consumer goods, and support artisans created a roadmap toward reducing imports and building self-sustaining economic ecosystems. Western corporations, which had long benefited from exporting raw materials cheaply and importing finished goods back at higher prices, recognized the threat posed by such policies. If successful, they would dismantle the economic model that had kept African countries trapped in dependency for decades. Taken together, these 10 projects formed a comprehensive strategy that unsettled Western powers. They represented more than political rhetoric. They were tangible steps toward a future defined by sovereignty, dignity, and independence. Each project was rooted in the belief that Burkina Faso could chart its own course, free from the dictates of external powers. And each project demonstrated that a small country, when led by determination and vision, could challenge global structures that had remained unshaken for generations. The tremors felt in Western capitals were not just about Burkina Faso itself. They were about the precedent it set for the entire African continent. If Burkina Faso could reclaim its resources, strengthen its military, feed its people, promote its culture, and diversify its economy, then so too could others. What truly frightened the West was not the success of any single project, but the possibility of contagion, the idea that Burkina Faso's path could inspire other nations to pursue similar courses. The tremors, therefore, were not merely localized shocks, but the first waves of a potential continental earthquake that could redefine Africa's relationship with the rest of the world.